Sarah Mitchell adjusted her black blazer one final time before stepping into the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Meridian Global Solutions. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Seattle sprawled below like a circuit board, its streets lit by the amber glow of evening traffic. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people missed, the kind that came from years of training where mistakes meant death, not just embarrassment. The room buzzed with low conversation as 12 executives in expensive suits discussed what they clearly considered the most important contract in the company's history. Sarah recognized most of them from the employee directory she'd studied that morning. These were people who made decisions worth millions of dollars before their first cup of coffee, who commanded respect through corner offices and stock options. "Gentlemen and lady," announced James Morrison, the company's chief operating officer, nodding towards Sarah with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "Thank you all for staying late tonight. We're here to discuss the Karamov Industries situation." Sarah knew the details already. Karamov Industries, a multinational corporation with mining operations across Eastern Europe, had been dealing with increasingly aggressive attacks on their facilities. What started as simple vandalism had escalated to coordinated assaults that suggested military-level planning. 3 facilities had been completely shut down in the past 6 months. The insurance claims alone were approaching $50 million. "Before we begin," Morrison continued, "I'd like everyone to meet Sarah Mitchell from our Security Consulting Division. Sarah will be observing tonight's discussion to better understand the client's needs." A few polite nods greeted this introduction, but Sarah noticed how several pairs of eyes quickly looked away. She was used to it. At 28, she looked young for someone claiming expertise in international security. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face held an earnestness that business executives often mistook for inexperience. "Now then," Morrison said, pulling up a presentation on the wall-mounted screen, "Karamov CO Viktor Petrov has personally requested our assistance. They're losing approximately $2 million per week in operational delays, and their stock price has dropped 15% since these attacks began." The presentation clicked to aerial photographs of damaged mining equipment, trucks overturned and burned out, administrative buildings with their windows blown out, guard towers that looked like they'd been hit with military-grade explosives. "Jesus," muttered Tom Bradley, the vice president of operations. "Looks like a war zone." "That's exactly what it is," said Sarah quietly. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her, and she realized she'd spoken without thinking. Morrison raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting input from someone he'd introduced as an observer. "I'm sorry," Morrison said with that same artificial smile. "Did you have something to add, Sarah?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came when people underestimated her. She'd felt it in basic training when drill instructors assumed she couldn't keep up. She felt it during SEAL selection when fellow candidates whispered that women didn't belong there. She'd felt it in Afghanistan when local commanders questioned her presence on joint operations. "I was just saying that the attack patterns in these photos suggest coordinated military-style tactics," she said, keeping her voice level. "The positioning of the explosive damage, the systematic targeting of infrastructure versus personnel, it's not random vandalism. Someone with serious training is planning these operations." Morrison's smile became even more strained. "I see. And you've reached this conclusion from looking at a few photographs." "The evidence is pretty clear if you know what to look for," Sarah replied. She stood up and walked to the screen, pointing to one of the images. "See how they targeted the communications equipment first? That's standard operating procedure for any military assault. Cut communications, then systematically eliminate defensive positions." She moved to another photo. "And look at the blast patterns on these buildings. They used shaped charges, not improvised explosive devices. That requires specialized knowledge and expensive equipment." The room was completely quiet now. Sarah could feel the skeptical stares, the unspoken questions about her credentials. She'd seen that look before, the one that said, "Who does this young woman think she is?" Morrison cleared his throat. "Well, That's interesting analysis. But I think we should focus on the business aspects of the situation rather than playing amateur detective. The dismissal stung, but Sarah had learned long ago not to show it. She returned to her seat and opened her notebook, pretending to take notes while her mind raced. These people had no idea who they were dealing with, and their ignorance could cost lives. As I was saying, Morrison continued, Karamov Industries has offered us a $12 million contract to provide comprehensive security consulting. This would be our largest international client to date. What exactly are they asking for? Asked Rebecca Chun, the company's legal counsel. Complete security assessment of all facilities, threat analysis, and recommendations for defensive improvements. They also want us to provide on-site security coordination for their most vulnerable locations. Bradley leaned forward in his chair. On-site coordination? You mean actually sending our people to these war zones? That's correct. They're specifically requesting that we station security consultants at 3 high-priority facilities in Moldova, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Moldova, Georgia, Kazakhstan. She knew those regions well. Too well. The memories tried to surface, but she pushed them down. Not here. Not now. Who exactly would we send for something like this? Asked David Park, the head of risk assessment. I mean, no offense to our security division, but analyzing corporate theft and coordinating overseas military operations are completely different skill sets. Morrison's gaze drifted toward Sarah for just a moment before he answered. We have several qualified consultants who could handle this assignment. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Several qualified consultants. She wondered if Morrison even knew what qualified meant in this context. Did he understand that the people attacking Karamov's facilities were likely former military contractors themselves? Did he realize that corporate security guards with tasers and pepper spray wouldn't last 5 minutes against coordinated assault teams? I have to ask, said Bradley, what makes us think we can succeed where local security forces have failed? I mean, these are sovereign nations with their own military and police. That's exactly the problem, Morrison replied. Local forces in these regions are often compromised. Corruption is endemic, and there's significant evidence that some of these attacks have been carried out with inside information. Karamov needs outside consultants they can trust completely. Sarah looked up from her notebook. Have you considered that this might not be about money? Morrison sighed audibly. I'm sorry, what now? The targeting is too specific, too strategic. If this were about theft or extortion, they'd be demanding ransom payments or stealing valuable equipment. But they're systematically destroying infrastructure. That suggests political motivation, not economic. Sarah, Morrison said, his patience clearly wearing thin, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we're here to discuss business strategy, not geopolitical theory. But the geopolitical situation is the business strategy, Sarah insisted. If you don't understand who's behind these attacks and why, any security measures you recommend will be useless. Bradley chuckled, the kind of laugh that made it clear he found her input amusing rather than valuable. Look, Sarah, I'm sure you've done some research on this, but international security consulting requires years of experience in the field. It's not something you can learn from reading news articles. Sarah felt her face flush. Reading news articles. If only they knew. Tom's right, Morrison agreed. This is an extremely complex situation that requires seasoned professionals with proven track records in international operations. And what track record do any of you have? Sarah asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Morrison's smile disappeared completely. Excuse me. Sarah closed her notebook and looked around the table. You're talking about sending consultants to active conflict zones in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. You're discussing coordination with local military forces and analysis of sophisticated military-style attacks. I'm just wondering what specific experience anyone in this room has with those types of operations. Morrison's face was turning red now. Sarah, I think you're forgetting your place here. You're observing this meeting, not conducting it. My place, Sarah repeated, her voice still calm, but with an edge that made several executives shift uncomfortably in their chairs. That's right, your place. You're here to listen and learn, not to question the credentials of senior management. Sarah stood up slowly. She'd reached the point where staying quiet would be impossible. Years of keeping her mouth shut, of letting people assume she was just another corporate nobody with delusions of competence, had finally caught up with her. "You want to talk about credentials?" she said, her voice carrying authority that hadn't been there before. "You want to discuss track records and international operations?" Morrison was on his feet now, too. "I want to discuss your attitude, young lady. I don't know what you think give you the right to walk into this room and question prove yourself." Morrison snapped, his professional composure completely gone. "If you think you know so much about military operations and international security, prove it. Show us exactly why we should listen to someone who looks like she just graduated from college." The challenge hung in the air between them. Sarah could feel every person in the room watching, waiting to see how she would respond to being put in her place by the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Global Solutions. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She opened it carefully and placed it on the conference table where everyone could see. Inside was a gold emblem that made Morrison's face go completely white. It was a SEAL trident, the warfare insignia of a United States Navy SEAL. But this wasn't a replica from a military surplus store or a souvenir from a museum gift shop. This was the real thing, worn and scratched from years of actual use, with a serial number that could be verified through official channels. The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning system. "My name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had commanded others in life and death situations. "I served 8 years with Naval Special Warfare Command, including 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. I've conducted more than 200 specialized operations in environments ranging from urban combat to maritime infiltration." Morrison was staring at the emblem like it might explode. "I left the Navy 6 months ago and joined Meridian because I wanted to use my skills in the private sector. But clearly, nobody bothered to read my actual resume." Sarah picked up the wallet and returned it to her pocket. "The attacks on Karamov's facilities are being carried out by former Russian Special Forces contractors. I can tell because I've seen their work before. They're using tactics and equipment that only a handful of organizations have access to. And if this company is serious about stopping them, you're going to need someone who knows how they think and how they operate." She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Morrison. "When you're ready to have a serious conversation about this contract, you know where to find me." Sarah left the conference room, closing the door quietly behind her, and walked toward the elevator bank. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of voices as 12 senior executives tried to process what had just happened. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped inside. As they closed, she caught a glimpse of Morrison through the conference room windows, holding his phone to his ear with the expression of a man who was about to make a very important call to human resources. Sarah smiled for the first time all day. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Sarah arrived at the office the next morning to find her key card had been deactivated. She stood in front of the security turnstiles in the Meridian Global Solutions lobby, watching other employees swipe their cards and walk through while hers produced nothing but red lights and angry beeping sounds. "Having trouble?" asked Marcus Webb, the building's head of security. Sarah had spoken with him a few times during her 6 months at the company. He was a former Army MP who treated everyone with the same respectful professionalism, regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. "Apparently my card isn't working," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Marcus ran her card through his master reader and frowned at the display. "Says here your access was suspended as of 11:30 last night." "That's unusual. Security suspensions usually happen during business hours." Sarah wasn't surprised. Morrison had probably spent half the night on the phone with HR and upper management trying to figure out how someone with her background had slipped through their hiring process. "I guess I should go upstairs and sort this out," she said. Marcus looked around the lobby, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Look, I don't know what happened yesterday, but word is you've got some serious people asking questions about you this morning." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve phone calls to Virginia and background checks that require security clearances to access. Marcus studied her face carefully. You want some advice? Whatever you did to get their attention, make sure you're ready to back it up. Sarah nodded her thanks and walked to the visitor's desk to get a temporary badge. The receptionist, normally friendly and talkative, handed over the badge without making eye contact. Word traveled fast in corporate environments, and Sarah could already feel the weight of curious stares from other employees. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, Sarah found Morrison waiting for her, along with two people she didn't recognize. One was a woman in her 50s wearing a navy blue suit that screamed federal government. The other was a man about Sarah's age in khakis and a polo shirt, but his posture and the way his eyes constantly scanned the environment marked him as military or former military. "Sarah," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to talk." They walked to a conference room different from the one they'd used the previous evening. This one was smaller, with no windows, and a sign on the door that read "Authorized Personnel Only." Sarah recognized it as one of the rooms used for sensitive client discussions. "Please sit down," Morrison said, gesturing to a chair across from the three of them. Sarah remained standing. "Let me introduce my colleagues," Morrison continued. "This is Catherine Reynolds from the Department of Defense, and Captain Mike Chun from Naval Special Warfare Command." Sarah looked at Captain Chun more closely. She didn't recognize him personally, but his bearing and the subtle tan lines around his eyes from wearing night vision goggles marked him as someone who'd recently returned from operational assignments. "Senior Chief Mitchell," Captain Chun said, using her former rank, "we've had some interesting conversations this morning." "I imagine you have, sir. Your service record is impressive. Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria. 4 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross that's still classified." Chun leaned forward in his chair. "What I'm having trouble understanding is why someone with your background is working corporate security for a civilian consulting firm." Sarah had been expecting this question since the moment she'd shown her trident the night before. The truth was complicated, and parts of it were still classified at levels that even Captain Chun might not have access to. "I completed my enlistment and decided to transition to the private sector," she said. "That's not what your file says," Catherine Reynolds interjected. "According to DoD records, you were recommended for advancement to warrant officer and offered a significant re-enlistment bonus. Men and women with your operational experience don't usually walk away from that kind of opportunity." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The real reason she'd left the Navy was sitting in a classified folder somewhere in Washington, along with after-action reports from her final deployment that would never see the light of day. Some operations were too sensitive for normal record-keeping, and some decisions had consequences that followed you even after you thought you'd left them behind. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my reasons for leaving the service are personal." Morrison cleared his throat. "Sarah, we're not trying to pry into your private affairs, but you have to understand our position here. Yesterday, you claimed expertise in international security operations, and now we discover you've been working here under what amounts to a false identity." "I never lied about anything," Sarah said firmly. "My resume clearly states my military background and operational experience. If nobody bothered to read it carefully, that's not my fault." Captain Chun opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized them. Surveillance photos from operations in Afghanistan and Syria, pictures that should have been buried so deep in classified archives that it would take weeks of paperwork just to access them. "These photos were taken during Operation Nightfall in 2018, Chun said. "They show you leading a team of Afghan special forces in an assault on a Taliban compound near Kandahar." Sarah stared at the photos without speaking. Operation Nightfall had been one of the most dangerous missions of her career, a joint operation with local forces to rescue kidnapped aid workers. The official reports had described it as a routine counterterrorism operation, but the reality had been much more complex. "And this one," Chun continued, sliding another photo across the table, "shows you providing medical assistance to wounded civilians after a suicide bombing in Baghdad. The after-action report describes how you single-handedly treated 14 casualties while under sniper fire. Sarah looked up from the photos. Captain, I'm not sure what point you're trying to make. The point is that you've been operating at levels of responsibility and expertise that go far beyond what anyone would expect from a corporate security consultant. The question is why you haven't been honest about the full extent of your background. Morrison leaned forward. Sarah, last night you made some very specific claims about the attacks on Karamov's facilities. You said they were being carried out by former Russian Special Forces contractors. How could you possibly know that? Sarah felt the walls closing in. The truth about how she knew was classified at levels that would require years of bureaucratic approval to declassify. But the lies were becoming harder to maintain. I've seen their work before, she said carefully. Where? Reynolds asked. Sarah looked around the room, weighing her options. These people clearly had access to information that went far beyond normal corporate background checks. They'd already seen classified photos from her deployments, which meant someone with serious authority had authorized this investigation. Syria, 2019, she said finally. There were Russian contractors operating in the region, conducting operations against Syrian opposition forces. I observed their tactics and equipment during joint operations with local allies. Captain Chin nodded slowly. The Wagner Group. Sarah didn't respond, but her expression confirmed that Chun was on the right track. That explains the tactical knowledge, Reynolds said. But it doesn't explain how you identified their involvement in the Karamov attacks, just from looking at photographs. Because I know their signature, Sarah said. Every military unit develops patterns, preferred tactics, equipment choices, operational preferences. The Wagner Group has very specific ways of conducting sabotage operations. The blast patterns, the targeting priorities, the systematic approach to infrastructure destruction, it all matches their standard operating procedures. Morrison was taking notes now, his skepticism from the previous evening replaced by intense interest. If you're right about who's behind these attacks, what does that mean for the Karamov contract? Sarah considered her answer carefully. It means that whoever accepts this assignment is going to be facing opponents with military-grade training, equipment, and support. It's not a job for corporate security guards or private investigators. It's a job for someone like you, Captain Chin observed. Yes, sir, it is. The room fell silent as the three interrogators exchanged glances. Sarah could see them weighing the risks and benefits of having someone with her background involved in what was clearly a much more serious situation than anyone had initially realized. Sarah, Morrison said finally, I owe you an apology. When I hired you 6 months ago, I obviously didn't fully understand what kind of experience you were bringing to this company. No, sir, you didn't. The question now is what we do going forward. Karamov Industries is expecting a detailed proposal from us by the end of the week. They want specific recommendations for security improvements and personnel assignments. Sarah waited for him to continue. I'm prepared to offer you the lead consultant position on this contract, Morrison said. Full operational authority, unlimited budget for equipment and personnel, and compensation commensurate with the level of expertise you've demonstrated. Sarah looked at Captain Chun and Reynolds. And what do your respective organizations think about a former Navy SEAL taking on what's essentially a covert action against Russian contractors? Chun smiled grimly. Officially, the U.S. military has no involvement in private security consulting between civilian corporations. Unofficially, we're very interested in any intelligence you might gather about Wagner Group operations. Reynolds nodded. The Department of Defense has been tracking Russian contractor activities throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Any information you could provide about their tactics, equipment, or operational planning would be extremely valuable. Sarah understood what they were really saying. This wasn't just a corporate security contract. It was an opportunity to gather intelligence on Russian military contractors while helping an American company protect its client. The kind of mission that straddled the line between private sector work and national security operations. There's one condition, Sarah said. Morrison raised an eyebrow. What's that? I choose my own team. If I'm going up against Wagner Group contractors, I need people who can match their level of training and experience. That means recruiting from military special operations communities not corporate security firms. That could be expensive, Morrison warned. Not as expensive as losing a $12 million contract because you sent the wrong people to do an impossible job. Captain Chun leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the expression of someone who was rapidly revising his assumptions. How many people would you need? Depends on the scope of operations. For assessment and planning, I could work with a small team, maybe 4 or 5 specialists. But if Karamov wants active security from multiple facilities, we need at least 20 people with specialized training. 20 former special operations personnel? Reynolds whistled softly. That's essentially a private military unit. Ma'am, that's exactly what it is. The Wagner Group doesn't send Boy Scouts to blow up mining facilities. If we want to stop them, we need people who can think like them and fight like them. Morrison was calculating numbers in his head, and Sarah could see him realizing that the profit margins on this contract were about to shrink dramatically. But she also saw him understanding that the alternative was almost certain failure, with all the reputation damage and legal liability that would entail. All right, he said finally, you have operational authority. Put together a proposal with specific personnel requirements and budget estimates. We'll present it to Karamov Industries on Friday. Sarah nodded. I'll need access to all the intelligence files on the attacks, including any information that hasn't been shared with us yet. Some of that information is classified, Reynolds warned. Then, I'll need appropriate clearances reactivated. Captain Chin stood up. I can facilitate that. Your security clearance is still valid. It was just moved to inactive status when you left the service. There's one more thing, Sarah said. I want complete autonomy in the field. No micromanagement from corporate headquarters, no second-guessing operational decisions, and no interference from people who don't understand the tactical situation. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Sarah, I can't just give you carte blanche to operate however you want. There are legal and financial considerations. Sir, with respect, if you want someone to follow corporate procedures and fill out paperwork in triplicate, hire a different consultant. If you want someone to stop Russian contractors from destroying Karamov's facilities, you need to let me do what I was trained to do. The room fell silent again. Sarah could feel them weighing the risks of giving an operative like her complete operational freedom against the potential rewards of actually succeeding where others had failed. Friday morning, Morrison said finally, present your proposal to the full executive team. If they approve it, you'll have everything you've asked for. Sarah smiled. Yes, sir. You won't be disappointed. As she walked toward the door, Captain Chun called her name. Senior Chief? Yes, sir. It's good to have you back in the game. Sarah nodded and left the conference room. In the hallway outside, she could see other employees trying to look busy while obviously straining to overhear whatever was happening behind the closed door. She walked to her desk and opened her laptop. She had 4 days to put together a proposal that would convince a room full of corporate executives to approve what amounted to a private military operation against Russian Special Forces contractors. It was going to be the most important presentation of her civilian career. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that made everything look slightly blurred around the edges. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blue suit. In 4 hours, she would be presenting her proposal to Meridian's executive team, and she knew that everything, her career, the Karamov contract, and potentially the safety of hundreds of workers, depended on what happened in that room. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Chun. Clearance reactivated. Intelligence package delivered to your office. Good hunting. Sarah smiled grimly. She'd spent the past 4 days working with contact from her Navy days, putting together a team that could handle what was essentially a military operation disguised as corporate consulting. The names on her roster read like a who's who of special operations, former SEALs, Marine Force Recon, Army Rangers, and Air Force combat controllers. All of them had operational experience in environments similar to what they'd face with Karamov Industries. When she arrived at the office, she found a thick manila envelope marked with security classifications that most corporate employees would never see. Inside were satellite photographs, intercepts of communications, and detailed intelligence assessments that painted a much clearer picture of what they were facing. The Wagner Group presence in the region was more extensive than even Sarah had suspected. They weren't just conducting sabotage operations against Karamov. They were systematically destabilizing the entire region's resource extraction industry. The attacks were part of a larger strategy to drive Western companies out of Eastern European and Central Asian markets, leaving Russian corporations free to move in and establish monopolies. Sarah spread the photographs across her desk and felt the familiar mental shift that came with mission planning. This wasn't corporate consulting anymore. This was a strategic operation with geopolitical implications that reached far beyond protecting mining equipment. Her computer chimed with an encrypted email from Master Chief Tony Rodriguez. Her former teammate, who was now working private contracts in the Middle East, got your message. Interested in the job. When do we start shooting bad guys? Sarah typed back. Hopefully never. This is about deterrence, not direct action. Rodriguez's response came immediately. That's what you said about Somalia. We all know how that turned out. Sarah smiled despite herself. Tony was right. Military operations had a way of escalating beyond their original scope, especially when you were dealing with opponents who didn't respect rules of engagement or international law. At 10 o'clock, she gathered her materials and walked to the large conference room where Meridian's executive team was already assembled. The same faces from Monday night, plus a few additional senior managers who'd been brought in specifically for this presentation. Morrison introduced her with considerably more respect than he'd shown earlier in the week. Ladies and gentlemen, Senior Chief Sarah Mitchell has prepared a comprehensive proposal for the Karamov Industries contract. Sarah, the floor is yours. Sarah connected her laptop to the presentation system and pulled up her first slide. Instead of corporate bullet points and flowcharts, the screen showed a detailed map of Eastern Europe and Central Asia with locations of Wagner Group activities highlighted in red. The attacks on Karamov Industries are not isolated incidents, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone briefing military commanders rather than business executives. They're part of a coordinated campaign by Russian military contractors to destabilize resource extraction throughout this entire region. She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of damaged facilities from 3 different countries. What you're looking at here are attack sites in Moldova, Kazakhstan, and Georgia. Same tactics, same equipment signatures, same systematic approach to infrastructure destruction. This is the work of the Wagner Group, Russian Special Forces contractors operating with state support. Bradley raised his hand. Wait, you're saying the Russian government is behind these attacks? I'm saying Russian contractors are conducting these operations with equipment and intelligence that could only come from state sources. Whether there's official government authorization is a political question above my pay grade. Sarah moved to the next slide, which showed organizational charts and operational timelines. Wagner Group typically deploys in teams of 8 to 12 operators, using military-grade equipment and tactics. They have extensive experience in urban combat, sabotage operations, and what they call deniable interventions, operations designed to look like local insurgent activities. Rebecca Chun, the legal counsel, looked troubled. Sarah, what you're describing sounds like we'd be engaging in military operations against Russian forces. That raises serious legal and diplomatic questions. Ma'am, we wouldn't be engaging in military operations. We'd be providing security consulting and defensive planning. The goal is to make Karamov's facilities too difficult and expensive to attack, not to hunt down Russian contractors. Morrison leaned forward. Explain the difference. Sarah clicked to a slide showing defensive positions and security improvements. Traditional security focuses on preventing ordinary criminals from stealing equipment or accessing restricted areas. What we're proposing is military-style defensive planning designed to deter or defeat coordinated assault teams. She pointed to architectural diagrams showing reinforced positions and surveillance systems. Hardened defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, integrated communication systems, and rapid response capabilities. We turn each facility into a fortress that would require a major military operation to successfully attack. And the personnel requirements? Asked David Park. Sarah clicked to her team roster. 24 specialists with military special operations backgrounds. For teams of 6 operators each, with rotation schedules that ensure continuous coverage of priority facilities. The salary numbers on the screen made several executives wince visibly. These are expensive people, Morrison observed. Yes, sir, they are. But consider the alternative. Karimov has already lost $50 million in damaged facilities. Their stock price has dropped another 8% since Monday. If these attacks continue, they'll be looking at bankruptcy within 18 months. Sarah moved to her cost-benefit analysis. Our proposed contract is worth $12 million over 2 years. If we successfully protect Karimov's facilities, they save approximately $200 million in projected losses. That's a 16-to-1 return on investment. And if we fail, asked Bradley, if we fail using conventional security measures, Karimov loses everything and we lose our reputation. If we fail using military-grade defensive planning, at least we'll have made the Wagner Group pay a significant price for their operations. Catherine Reynolds, who had been listening silently from the back of the room, spoke up. Sarah, walk us through a typical defensive scenario. How would your team respond to a Wagner Group assault? Sarah had been waiting for this question. She clicked to a tactical diagram showing a mining facility with defensive positions marked. Wagner Group typically begins operations with communications disruption and perimeter reconnaissance. Our early warning systems would detect their approach and initiate lockdown procedures. Facility personnel would move to hardened positions while response teams moved to intercept. She traced movement patterns on the diagram. The goal isn't to engage in prolonged firefights. It's to make the assaults so difficult and costly that the attackers withdraw rather than risk casualties and equipment. You're talking about potentially killing Russian nationals, Reynolds pointed out. Ma'am, I'm talking about defending legitimate facilities against illegal attacks. If Russian contractors choose to assault well-defended positions, any casualties would be the result of their own decisions. Morrison was studying the budget numbers with the expression of someone trying to decide whether the potential rewards justified the risks. Sarah, be honest with me. What are the chances that this escalates beyond what we can handle? Sarah had been dreading this question because the honest answer was complicated. Based on her experience with Wagner Group tactics, there was a significant chance that they would respond to effective defensive measures by escalating their own operations. But there was also a chance that demonstrating serious resistance would convince them to focus their efforts on easier targets. Sir, there's no way to predict how Wagner Group will respond to meeting serious resistance. What I can tell you is that doing nothing guarantees failure, and half measures will likely result in casualties without deterrent effect. So we either go all in or we walk away? Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm saying. The room fell silent as 12 senior executives contemplated authorizing what amounted to a private military operation. Sarah could see them weighing profit margins against legal risks, corporate reputation against potential international incidents. Finally, Morrison spoke. Sarah, step outside for a few minutes while we discuss this. Sarah gathered her materials and walked into the hallway, where she found Marcus Webb waiting for her. How'd it go? He asked. Hard to tell. They're either going to give me everything I asked for or fire me for proposing something completely insane. Marcus chuckled. Knowing this company, probably both. 20 minutes later, Morrison opened the conference room door and invited Sarah back inside. The expressions on the executives' faces were unreadable, but she noticed that Catherine Reynolds was no longer in the room. Sarah, Morrison said, we've made a decision. You have authorization to proceed with your proposal, with one modification. What's that? The Department of Defense will be providing additional intelligence support and coordination. Ms. Reynolds has arranged for a military liaison to work with your team. Sarah nodded. She'd expected something like this. An operation with geopolitical implications wouldn't be allowed to proceed without government oversight. There's one more thing, Morrison continued. Viktor Petrov wants to meet with you personally before finalizing the contract. He's flying to Seattle next week. Any particular reason? He wants to look the person in the eye who's going to be responsible for protecting his facilities and his people. Apparently, he doesn't trust anyone he hasn't met face to face. Sarah understood. In environments where trust could mean the difference between life and death, personal relationships mattered more than corporate credentials. When does he arrive? Tuesday afternoon. You'll have dinner with him and his security team that evening. Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in her chest. Once she shook hands with Viktor Petrov, there would be no backing out. She would be committed to an operation that could determine the future of international resource extraction in one of the world's most unstable regions. One last question, Bradley said. What makes you think we can succeed where local security forces have failed? Sarah looked around the room at faces that were still adjusting to the reality of who she was and what she represented. Because local security forces are trying to fight a conventional crime problem using conventional methods. Wagner Group contractors aren't conventional criminals. They're military professionals conducting strategic operations with state-level support. She clicked to her final slide, which showed before and after photos of successful defensive operations from Afghanistan and Iraq. The only way to defeat military-grade threats is with military-grade responses. And that's what I do. Morrison closed his portfolio. All right, Sarah, you got your contract. Don't make us regret this decision. Sarah smiled. Sir, by the time I'm done, the Wagner Group is going to regret ever hearing the name Karamov Industries. As the executives filed out of the room, Sarah remained behind to pack up her materials. Through the conference room windows, she could see Seattle's skyline emerging from the morning fog. And for the first time since leaving the Navy, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. Viktor Petrov was not what Sarah had expected. The CEO of Karamov Industries stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of thick glasses that suggested too many years spent reading financial reports in poor lighting. But when he shook Sarah's hand in the private dining room of Seattle's most exclusive restaurant, his grip had the firmness of someone who'd built a multinational corporation from nothing. Senior Chief Mitchell, he said in accented English, I have been very much looking forward to this meeting. Sarah had spent the afternoon studying Petrov's background. Born in Moldova when it was still part of the Soviet Union, he'd emigrated to the United States in 1991 and built Karamov Industries into one of Eastern Europe's largest resource extraction companies. He was known for personally visiting every facility under attack, for refusing to pay protection money to criminal organizations, and for maintaining operational security practices that bordered on paranoia. Mr. Petrov, thank you for flying out here personally. I understand how valuable your time is. Petrov's security detail, 2 men who looked like former military, took positions near the restaurant's exits while maintaining sight lines to their principal. Sarah approved of their professionalism. Time is indeed valuable, Petrov agreed, settling into his chair. But money without life is worthless, and life without security is impossible. So we talk. Over dinner, Petrov described the escalating attacks with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd been dealing with violence for months. What emerged was a picture of systematic intimidation that went far beyond simple sabotage. They are not trying to steal from us, Petrov explained between courses. They destroy equipment, yes, but they leave valuable materials untouched. They attack infrastructure, but they avoid casualties that would bring international attention. This is psychological warfare designed to force us from the market. Have you received any direct communications from the attackers? Sarah asked. Petrov nodded grimly. 3 weeks ago, a man called my personal phone number, a number known only to my family and closest associates. He spoke in Russian with a Moscow accent. He said that continued operations in certain regions would become increasingly difficult and suggested that selling our holdings to Russian companies would be financially advantageous. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. That was classic Wagner Group intimidation, subtle enough to avoid direct legal action, but clear enough to leave no doubt about the consequences of noncompliance. What was your response? I told him that Karamov Industries does not negotiate with terrorists, regardless of which government sponsors them. Sarah studied Petrov's face and saw the determination that had built his company and kept it operational despite months of attacks. She also saw the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a war with no end in sight. Mr. Petrov, I need to be completely honest with you about what we're proposing. If we implement the security measures I've outlined, the Wagner Group will likely respond with escalated operations. They might move from sabotage to direct assault, and that means potential casualties. Petrov set down his wine glass and leaned forward. Senior Chief, I have visited every facility that has been attacked. I have looked into the eyes of workers whose livelihoods have been destroyed by these people. Some of them have families who depend on wages from jobs that no longer exist because of Russian intimidation. His voice carried a quiet intensity that reminded Sarah of mission briefings before high-stakes operations. If we allow them to succeed through fear, they will move to the next company and the next until every Western business in Eastern Europe is either destroyed or controlled by Moscow. This is not just about Karamov Industries. This is about whether rule of law means anything in the modern world. Sarah nodded. She'd seen this kind of strategic thinking before, usually from military commanders who understood that some battles had implications far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. In that case, we need to discuss operational parameters. My team will require complete authority to establish defensive positions, modify facilities for security purposes, and coordinate with local law enforcement and military units. You will have whatever you need, Petrov said immediately. Money, equipment, personnel, there are no limitations. What about legal restrictions? Some of what we're proposing operates in gray areas of international law. Petrov smiled for the first time that evening. Senior Chief, I have been operating in gray areas of international law since 1991. My legal team specializes in what they call creative interpretations of jurisdictional boundaries. If you can protect my facilities and my people, I will handle any legal complications. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before deploying on a mission where success would require pushing the boundaries of what was officially authorized. What do you need us operational? How quickly can you deploy? Sarah had been hoping you would ask that question. My advanced team can be on-site within 72 hours. Full deployment within 2 weeks. Petrov's expression became deadly serious. There is something else you need to know. 3 days ago, we received intelligence that Wagner Group is planning a major operation against our facility in Moldova. Our source believes they intend to completely destroy the processing plant and blame the attack on local separatist groups. Sarah felt her chest tighten. How reliable is this intelligence? Very reliable. The source is someone inside the local government who has been providing information for several months. He says the attack is scheduled for some time in the next 2 weeks. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into operational planning mode. 2 weeks to deploy, establish defensive positions, and prepare for a major assault by professional military contractors. It was an extremely tight timeline, even with experienced personnel. Mr. Petrov, if this intelligence is accurate, we need to accelerate deployment. I can have a team on the ground in Moldova within 48 hours, but they'll be operating with minimal equipment and support. What would they need? Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through the contact list she'd been building over the past week. 6 operators with combat experience in similar environments, basic defensive equipment, and authorization to coordinate with local authorities. Done. What else? Real-time intelligence sharing. If your source has information about Wagner Group planning or timing, I need to know immediately. Petrov nodded. My security chief will provide direct communication with our intelligence network. Sarah looked across the table at a man who was essentially authorizing a private military operation to protect his business interests. In most contexts, such a decision would be considered extreme. But, given what they were facing, it was probably the only rational response. Mr. Petrov, I want to make sure you understand what you're authorizing. If Wagner Group assaults our defensive positions, people are going to get hurt, possibly killed. That includes your employees, my team members, and Wagner Group contractors. Petrov was quiet for a long moment, staring into his wine glass. Senior Chief, my grandfather built the first Karamov mining operation in 1943 while German and Soviet armies were fighting across his land. My father expanded the business while Soviet tanks were parked in his backyard. I will not be the generation that loses everything because I was too afraid to fight back. Sarah stood and extended her hand. Mr. Petrov, you just hired yourself some very expensive security consultants. Petrov shook her hand with both of his. Senior Chief Mitchell, you just accepted responsibility for an operation that will determine whether Western businesses can operate safely in Eastern Europe for the next decade. As Sarah left the restaurant, her phone was already buzzing with text messages from team members responding to deployment orders. Master Chief Rodriguez, wheels up in 6 hours. Hope you're right about this one. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, former Marine Force Recon. Gear packed, passport current. Time to earn our money. Sarah smiled as she scrolled through the responses. In 24 hours, some of the most experienced military operators in the world would be boarding flights to Moldova, carrying equipment that most people only saw in movies, and preparing for an operation that would test everything they'd learned in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. The Wagner Group had no idea what was coming. Sarah spent the rest of the evening in her apartment, reviewing satellite imagery and facility layouts while coordinating with her advance team. The Karamov facility in Moldova was a sprawling complex of mining equipment, processing plants, and administrative buildings spread across nearly a square mile of countryside. It was designed for efficiency, not defense, which meant every aspect of a security plan would require creative solutions. By midnight, she had preliminary defensive positions identified and equipment lists compiled. By 2 a.m., she had confirmation that Rodriguez and 3 other team members were en route to Bucharest, where they would drive across the Romanian border into Moldova. By dawn, she would be boarding her own flight to coordinate what would either be the most successful security operation in corporate history or a very expensive disaster. As she packed her gear, body armor, communications equipment, and weapons that required special transportation arrangements, Sarah felt the familiar mental shift that came with transitioning from planning to execution. Everything that happened from this point forward would depend on split-second decisions, tactical adaptation, and the kind of teamwork that could only be built through shared experience in life and death situations. The Wagner Group was about to learn that some security consultants had backgrounds that went far beyond corporate credentials. The attack came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly as Sarah's intelligence sources had predicted. She was positioned in the hardened observation post overlooking the Karamov facility in Moldova when the first explosions lit up the perimeter. Through her night vision scope, she could see 8 figures in tactical gear approaching from multiple directions, professional movements that confirmed her assessment of Wagner Group involvement. Contact, contact, contact. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece. 8 operators, military kit, approaching from sectors 2 and 4. Sarah keyed her radio. All stations, implement defensive plan Alpha. Remember, we're protecting the facility, not hunting bad guys. What followed was 43 minutes of the most intense combat Sarah had experienced since Afghanistan. Wagner Group contractors had come prepared for a quick sabotage operation against a lightly defended facility. Instead, they found themselves facing prepared positions manned by former Navy SEALs, Marines, and Army Rangers who had spent weeks studying their tactics and preparing countermeasures. The attackers' first mistake was attempting to cut communications before beginning their assault. Sarah's team had anticipated this and installed redundant systems that activated automatically when primary communications went down. Their second mistake was assuming that the defensive positions they'd observed during reconnaissance were the only ones that existed. By sunrise, 3 Wagner Group contractors were in custody, 2 had been evacuated with serious injuries, and the remainder had withdrawn after realizing they were facing military-level resistance. Not a single piece of Karamov equipment had been damaged, and no civilians had been injured. More importantly, word of the failed attack spread quickly through the private military contractor community. Within a week, attacks against Karamov facilities in Georgia and Kazakhstan had stopped completely. Now, 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same Seattle conference room, where James Morrison had once demanded that she prove herself. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Instead of skeptical executives questioning her credentials, she was briefing senior management on the expansion of Meridian's international security division. The Karimov contract has generated more than $60 million in additional business, she reported to the assembled executives. We currently have security consulting agreements with 12 international corporations operating in high-risk environments across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and North Africa. Morrison, who had been promoted to chief executive officer after the success of the Karimov operation, nodded approvingly. Sarah, when you first walked into this room, I thought you were an inexperienced consultant with delusions of grandeur. I was wrong, and I want to publicly apologize for my initial assessment. Sarah appreciated the gesture, but her mind was already focused on future operations. Success against the Wagner Group had established Meridian as a serious player in international security consulting, but it had also attracted attention from other threat actors who viewed their capabilities as a challenge to be overcome. Sir, the success in Moldova has created new opportunities, but it's also created new risks. We're now on the target list of several organizations that view our operations as interference with their regional activities. Rebecca Chun, still the company's legal counsel, but now much more respectful of operational realities, leaned forward. What kind of specific threats are we looking at? Sarah clicked to a world map showing Meridian's current and potential operations. Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, Chinese state-sponsored contractors in Africa, and Russian intelligence services who aren't happy about our interference with Wagner Group activities. Success has made us a high-value target. Bradley, now head of international operations, studied the map with obvious concern. Are you saying that protecting our clients could result in direct retaliation against Meridian itself? I'm saying that when you operate at this level, neutrality is not an option. Every successful mission creates enemies who view your capabilities as threats to their own operations. Morrison considered this. What do you recommend? Sarah had been expecting this question and had spent considerable time developing her answer. We expand our capabilities and make retaliation too costly to attempt. Right now, we're operating as a high-end security consulting firm. What we need to become is a full-spectrum strategic security organization. She clicked to organizational charts showing proposed team structures. 24 additional operators, intelligence analysts, communication specialists, and logistics coordinators. Essentially, a private military organization capable of handling multiple operations simultaneously. The salary and equipment numbers on the screen made several executives wince, just as they had 6 months earlier. But Sarah noticed that nobody questioned whether the investment was justified. How long would it take to build this organization? Morrison asked. 18 months for full operational capability. But I can have expanded teams operational in 3 months if we accelerate recruitment. And the legal implications? Chen asked. Sarah smiled. The legal implications are that we continue operating in the gray areas of international law, but with better lawyers and more comprehensive insurance policies. Chen nodded. I can work with that. Morrison stood and walked to the windows overlooking Seattle. Sarah, 6 months ago, you were working as a junior security consultant with a secret background. Now you're proposing to build one of the world's most capable private military organizations. That's a significant evolution. Sarah joined him at the window, looking out at the city where her civilian career had begun with a combination of frustration and concealed identity. Sir, evolution is adaptation to changing circumstances. The circumstances have changed. How so? 6 months ago, international security threats were handled by government military forces with clear rules of engagement and established chains of command. Today, we're facing state-sponsored contractors who operate outside international law while maintaining plausible deniability for their sponsors. She pointed toward the harbor, where cargo ships carried goods from around the world. The global economy depends on the ability of legitimate businesses to operate safely in unstable regions. If organizations like Wagner Group can systematically destroy that capability through intimidation and violence, the economic implications are enormous. Morrison nodded slowly. You're saying that private security organizations like ours are becoming essential infrastructure for international commerce. I'm saying we're becoming the only option for companies that want to operate in regions where government military forces can't or won't provide adequate protection. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Captain Chun. New situation developing in Kazakhstan. Mining consortium under systematic attack. Interested, Sarah showed the message to Morrison. Sir, this is what I'm talking about. Success creates opportunities, but it also creates responsibility. Companies are coming to us because they know we can handle situations that conventional security firms can't touch. Morrison read the message and handed the phone back. What would you tell Captain Chun? Sarah looked around the conference room at executives who had learned to trust her judgment in situations where their corporate experience provided no guidance. I'd tell them we're interested, but our rates just went up significantly. Morrison laughed. Sarah, you've turned this company into something I never imagined when I hired you. Part of me wonders if I've created a monster. Sir, you didn't create anything. You just gave someone with the right background an opportunity to use her skills in a different context. Sarah walked back to the presentation screen and clicked to her final slide, which showed a simple mission statement. Meridian Global Solutions. Protecting legitimate business in an illegitimate world. This is what we are now, she said. This is what we've always been, actually. I just made it explicit. Morrison returned to his seat. All right, Sarah, you have authorization to proceed with organizational expansion. But I want regular briefings on operational activities, and I want advance warning if any situation looks like it might escalate beyond what we can handle. Sarah nodded. Sir, I can promise you regular briefings, but escalation is unpredictable. We're dealing with state-sponsored contractors and international criminal organizations. Every operation carries the potential for consequences you can't foresee. Are you saying we should reconsider this expansion? Sarah thought about Rodriguez and Santos and the other operators who are currently deployed around the world, protecting facilities and personnel that would otherwise be at the mercy of organizations like Wagner Group. She thought about Viktor Petrov and the determination in his eyes when he decided to fight back rather than surrender to intimidation. She thought about the dozens of companies that had contacted Meridian since news of the Moldova operation had spread through corporate security networks. No, sir. I'm saying we should embrace what we've become and make sure we're better at it than anyone else. Morrison smiled. In that case, Senior Chief Mitchell, welcome to your new position as Director of Strategic Security Operations. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with formal authority over operations that could determine the success or failure of international businesses in some of the world's most dangerous regions. It was a long way from the corporate security consulting position she'd accepted 6 months earlier, but it felt like a natural evolution of everything she'd learned in 8 years of Navy service. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. As the executives filed out of the conference room, Sarah remained behind to respond to Captain Chen's message. She typed, Meridian is interested in the Kazakhstan situation. Advanced team can deploy within 48 hours. Send operational briefing to secure email. She hit send and looked out the window at Seattle skyline, where cargo ships and container cranes represented the global commerce that her organization was now responsible for protecting. Somewhere in Kazakhstan, another group of contractors was probably planning attacks against another legitimate business, confident that they could operate with impunity. They were about to learn otherwise. Sarah packed her materials and walked toward the elevator, her mind already shifting into mission planning mode. In 48 hours, she would be briefing another team of operators for another operation in another dangerous corner of the world. It was exactly where she belonged.